Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Kohler Group's Expansion into China webinar series. This is part 8 of 10 webinar sessions. The title of today's presentation is China Labor Practices, Legal, Tax and Insurance Issues, a Step-by-Step Approach. First of all, a short introduction of our topic today. The Chinese labor system is not as straightforward as in the West, and there are several aspects that require due consideration, including the following three. General labor regulations, which include contract terms, termination laws, and severance packages, as well as frequently asked questions on maternity leave, holiday leave, death in the family leave, etc. Updates and procedures for immigration processes, including differences between Hong Kong, Macao and Taiwan citizens versus the rest of the world, and how to renew one's visa should they change jobs within China. The third aspect is important social insurance and tax considerations for mainland Chinese and foreign employees. I'm very pleased to have our director at Kohler Group, Mrs. Christina Kohler-Coluccia, as our speaker today. Before we begin today's presentation, allow me to settle some administrative matters. I would like to make sure that the sound system is working perfectly. If you could hear the introduction and you can hear me clearly, please click the hand button in the control panel, which will give me the signal that we have no technical issues. If you're using a computer, mic and speaker system and you have trouble listening, please note that there is the option to dial in via the telephone by simply clicking this in the audio section of the control panel. Please note that we're recording today's webinar session, and the presentation, together with the recording, will be distributed to the registrants by the end of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, as we do in all our webinar sessions, we do encourage all attendees to submit their questions as well as comments into the question section of the control panel. The presentation today will last approximately 45 minutes, after which we aim to have a 15 to 20 minutes Q&A session. Please don't be shy in inserting your questions or sharing experiences. I will now pass the microphone to Christina, who will introduce Kohler Group and herself, and will then begin with today's presentation.
Barbara, thank you very much. Welcome to all of you that have joined Kohler Group's Expansion into China webinar series. For those of you that are new to Kohler Group and our series, just a very brief introduction to who we are. Kohler Group, a CSC company, provides a wide range of market entry consulting, incorporation, tax accounting, and HR services to organizations that are entering and expanding within the Asian region, primarily in Hong Kong, Singapore, and China. Our firm was established in 1979 and has grown to having just over 120 professionals located throughout our 10 offices, 8 in China, as well as Hong Kong and Singapore. Our main objective is to help foreign investors with their market entry in all aspects related to the administrative functions, such as the accounting, the tax, the legal compliance, and HR services. One of our unique advantages is that we do speak over 10 languages internally, including all the local dialects, which allows us to speak not only with our clients in their mother tongue, but also to communicate locally with the staff that the clients may have on the ground. A little bit about myself. My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia, and I will be the speaker for today's presentation. I've been with Kohler Group since 2003 when I first opened our Shanghai office, and I've grown our China business to having just over 8 offices in China and having just over 60 professionals working within the mainland Chinese region. I've helped clients not only with their market entry and expansion in China, but unfortunately also their liquidations and exits from the market. I'm co-author of our monthly magazine, ChinaInvest.biz, which, if you're interested in subscribing to, is free of charge and can be done so easily on our homepage. So without further wasting time, I would like to begin today's presentation. Now, I formulated this presentation in such a way that I'll be focusing on the legal aspects of employment for foreigners as well as for locals, looking at the immigration policies, and this will lead on then to social insurance aspects and finally tax aspects that one needs to consider. Now, why do secondments exist in China? Why do foreign investors second expatriates to the Chinese region? Well, initially, the reasons were the following. One was to provide staff on the ground who know the project's full hand and are there for a short period, usually for 3, 6, 9 months. As time has progressed, obviously certain projects have reached obstacles along their way, and as a consequence, staff have had to prolong their visas and have had to stay for longer periods of time in China. So really, it's sending expatriates who are familiar with the projects and are based in China for these short and long-term projects. In addition to all of that, you may want to send an expatriate to establish the local operations in China and to implement all of the internal procedures that exist both in the headquarters and then replicate that into the Chinese subsidiary. So that's one of the reasons also that many foreign investors second expatriates to develop these systems internally. The other is the supervision of local operations, and these positions can be a variety of things: sales directors, sales managers, finance managers, anybody who's in key positions in certain divisions. They may want to second people from the head office or from other locations to manage and again implement the systems within the local operations, and I hate to say it, but act as a sort of spy to make sure that everything is remaining in compliance in terms of the legal, tax, and just internal workflows that are occurring. It's also building relationships with local partners, and I think this aspect really depends on the type of industry that you're in. So in certain industries, it's always good to have a white face, meet with the local partners and the local distributors to show the commitment to the market that there is somebody from the head office that's being represented and can discuss and negotiate with the local partners. A very common negotiation tactic by local mainland Chinese is saying, well, I'm not the final decision maker. I will have to go back to my boss, who is the decision maker. And for many local partners, this is just a waste of time tactic. You are, you're trying to negotiate on a longer term, and sometimes they just want somebody who is there, who is a decision maker, who can make those decisions, and generally is a white face to the company. There are also temporary arrangements for short-term absences that can occur. For example, maternity leaves of certain individuals, and these positions maybe can only be replaced by people that are based in the headquarters. And the last, which for me I think is the main reason most people do secondments, is that employers are obviously promoting cross-border experiences for their expatriate staff. So, that's also a benefit that can be given to foreign employees to not only join your company, but then to share these experiences by moving and relocating abroad. So I think if you have an understanding, why are you actually seconding an individual, that will also give you an analysis in terms of timing. How long is this person going to be there? How long should the employment contract be? What type of visas are then required? And ultimately, does this individual still want to keep a portion of their salary in their home jurisdiction, or will they be gaining their full salary and allowances locally in China? The other aspect is also looking at the family side of these secondments, these expatriates that are being seconded. Do they have a family? Is the family willing to relocate to China as well? Or are they going to stay in the home jurisdiction and therefore need split salaries? So understanding why the person is going, for how long this person is going to be there, will help to draft the employment contracts, help to understand what visas are required, and ultimately then make a tax planning that is essential for these expatriates that are being relocated. Now, there are a series of legal implications. Once you know the status of the individual and that they're interested in going, the next is really understanding the legal, tax, and immigration issues. So one of the key things you need to understand is that you do need to have an invitation by the local legal entity. This invitation comes in the form of an employment contract. So you will need to have a Chinese written employment contract that will be submitted to the Labor Bureau in order to be able to obtain the work permit and residence visa for this individual. So I get a lot of clients who come to me and say, well, we have a secondment agreement, and the secondment agreement is signed by the headquarters. This is great, but if you want to keep the terms and conditions of the secondment agreement, you will need to have to add a third party into that agreement, which is the local legal entity, and then translate that agreement into Chinese to be submitted to the Labor Bureau. Again, to be able to obtain the work permit and the residence visa. The other aspect is the salaries and the social insurance, and this is really an aspect you need to consider from an accounting perspective, as well as just looking at what the individual needs in terms of funds when they're based in China. So generally on secondment agreements, it could very well be that the headquarters is paying the salary of the individual. In theory and in practice, the local entity should be paying the salary, the portioned salary, if any, the social insurance and the taxes to the individual. And then a management fee should be cross-checked between the Chinese entity and the headquarter to invoice for that secondment amount. That would be the proper and most transparent way to organize all of that, which again is why you should talk to advisors locally. What is needed on the ground in China to understand in terms of documentation, in terms of accounting principles, in order to avoid questions from auditors and from tax bureaus in regards to the whole relationship between the headquarter, the staff, and the local entity. You should also be aware that individual income tax will need to be paid locally based on the apportioned salary that's being paid locally. And although I'm no expert because every jurisdiction is very different, the employee as well as the headquarter, they should be aware of what is liable to this individual in their home jurisdiction in terms of taxes, in terms of social insurance. So I've kind of outlined here very briefly what are all the types of considerations you need to consider. And this doesn't even match up to the amount of documents you then have to create and that need to be signed and chopped in order to be able to be legally employed in China, be able to declare your taxes in China, and to be able to obtain your visas and work permits. Now, the immigration system in China, and I have been able now to compare it to Europe as well as in the US, is not as complicated as many people think it is. There are a lot of procedures that have to occur, but in terms of time frame, it's actually relatively straightforward. It's step by step by step by step, and there are no changes to those steps. There might be slight changes depending on where you're establishing your entity, but the time frame is relatively fixed, and the documents are relatively fixed. So in terms of immigration, there are a variety of work visas that can be obtained by foreign nationals. There are special talent visas, which is primarily for educators, professors, people that are coming to China, for example, with Cirque du Soleil, so they're there for an interim period. So all the acrobats and all of that, they would need to have a special talent visa. For your standard business, if you're establishing an entity in China and you're just very simply seconding an individual to be based there, then you're looking at the formal work permit and residence visas that you would need to obtain. Many people, many companies, unfortunately, do not go through this route of obtaining work permits and residence visas, which is a pity because it actually is detrimental to the individual that is actually being seconded to the region. Now, there have been a lot of regulations that have changed locally in order to push companies and individuals to get the work permits and residence visas. Just to give you an example, all schools in China require to see the work permits and residence visas of the parent who is being employed. And they also want to see the residence visas of the children that are going to be going to that school in order to accept them. This used to not be the case, which means people would come in on business visas, family members would come in on business visas, and now they've really made the rules very strict in order to make sure people are staying in China legally and are declaring their taxes, because primarily if you don't get the work permit and residence visa, you're not actually declaring taxes. And since the country is so huge and there's such a high level of population, the tax bureaus don't have the resources to chase everybody, although that is slowly changing, and I'll explain that in the tax phase of this presentation. So in order to get the work permits and the residence visas, there are usually 5 steps which need to occur. The first 2 steps is obtaining 2 types of certificates which need to be taken by the individual to the Chinese embassy in their home jurisdiction in order to be able to obtain a Z visa. With this Z visa, you can then come back into the country of China, and you have 30 days to go through the process of doing a health check, step 3, obtaining your your work permit, step 4, and obtaining your residence visa, step 5. In order to do all of those last 3 steps, you do need to have a local residence address in China, whether it's through a service department or whether it's the actual residential address of the individual. So it is important that when this individual comes back to China, they already have a residence available to them. Now, there are a lot of severe penalties for breaking the law if you are not legally employing individuals. And there is a there is a division within the Public Security Bureau that does check companies on a sporadic basis that the visas have been properly issued and are renewed on an annual basis as well. So it is important to make sure, everybody is coming to China with the right documents, the right visas, and it's not something they have to think about, and they don't have to leave China every 30 days because usually that's the standard multiple entry visas. So it is just important, as you're seconding an individual to China, make sure that he's gone through the right immigration procedures, and it's not something he has to worry about or anything like that. Now, I wanted to go through some key employment law compliance issues, whether you're hiring a foreigner or whether you're hiring a local. Now, if you're hiring a foreign employee, what a lot of people do is a lot of companies do is they have two employment contracts. One is the secondment agreement, and then they have a one-page labor contract written in Chinese that is then submitted to the Labor Bureau to obtain the work permit. In my opinion, this is a big no-no. First of all, work with one contract and have 3 parties listed within it. Make sure all the terms and conditions that you have in that agreement are the same. If you decide to go with the 2 agreements, then don't just be lazy and create a one-page document that doesn't even compare to the original secondment agreement that's been negotiated back and forth and has been finally signed. If you are looking to have 2 agreements, make sure that the content is identical. Why is that? Well, there are a lot of foreigners now in China that are either resigning, and because they don't have a proper Chinese contract, they're asking for additional compensation from the Chinese company, not from the headquarters, from the Chinese company. And as they received a work permit and residence visa from the Chinese company, they are able then to fight in a local court in China. And actually, ultimately, the secondment agreement that was signed from the headquarters has no effect in China, unless it's signed through the three various parties. In addition, if you're looking to fire a foreigner in China, the foreigner can also backlash at you with that Chinese contract. So in order to be bulletproof, you really want to make sure these contracts are identical in terms of content. Whenever you're looking at employment contracts, what you should also be looking at is employee handbooks, which most SME companies don't even consider, because what they think is, we're starting up small with one employee, we're just going to tell him what our company policies are, we're not going to put anything in writing, and that's where dilemmas then start arising. So what you want to do is make sure you have the employment contract as well as the employee handbook. The employee handbook is a handbook that is ultimately for any expatriate, any foreigner, as well as any mainland Chinese. It is highlighting your company policies in terms of working hours, in terms of rest days, in terms of overtime, in terms of annual leave, etc., in terms of maternity benefits, or even in the cases of death within a family, how many days do you get off? Actually, a lot of the local labor policies should be within this employee handbook, that everybody has a guideline as to what they can and cannot do. And then there should be procedures internally. Who are they reporting to, and who should they ask for permission to obtain leave from, if they want to obtain leave? In the employment contract, I've highlighted also here 7 points that, from my perspective, should also be written in the employment contract. Working hours, rest days, maternity benefits if you're female, etc., and then also retirement concerns. Now, one of the key aspects that I think is, missed out by a lot of companies is the fact that they are so rush to get into the market. They hire people either through headhunters or they find individuals themselves, and they forget to really formulate the relationship. And you would be surprised, although it is common sense to have a written contract, a lot of companies don't. It's something they just don't think about. And this is where dilemmas arise, because if you don't have a written contract signed by both parties within 30 days of the formal start date of that individual, the employee, if he gets fed up and doesn't like the job, could fight back and say, I want double pay. I don't have a written contract signed by both parties. I want double pay until I do get a signed contract. So written contracts are a must, and make sure you've had them reviewed by professionals, that all the content is within it, that everything you need that can help you fighting the arbitration or fighting the labor arbitration or even going through mediation is within it. Indirect employment is also something extremely common. You may not have an entity in China, and you may be seconding individuals who are just on business visas or tourist visas, or you may be even hiring local Chinese employees who are signing freelance agreements, and I put freelance agreements in quotations, with the head office. And these freelance agreements might even just be email correspondences. They might not be any formal type of written agreement, which again is a big no-no. Freelance agreements in China are not 100% black and white legal. As such, you want to have something in writing that protects you at the headquarters in terms of social insurance that should be paid by the employee, taxes that should be paid by the employee. Who's that responsibility falling on? You want to be able to protect yourself in case this individual obtains leverage on you and fights you for it in the labor arbitration committee. You need to make sure the employment contracts, even the freelance agreements, have all the mandatory provisions inside in relation to termination, non-competition, IP, confidentiality, and just standard of conduct. That should all be within it. And again, as I mentioned, consequences for failure to conclude a written contract can be that the employee says, I want double pay until I have a written contract. So you need to be aware of all of this and make sure that in terms of documentation, and this is all really corporate compliance issues, are there, are filed, and again are renewed on an annual basis. A question that I get asked quite often is, should I sign a fixed term contract or should I sign an open-ended contract? Now in China, the regulation is that if you do sign a fixed term contract, you can only sign 2 of those. And then on the 3rd time round, it has to be an open-ended contract. From my perspective, what I've seen is that you really need about 1 year to know whether you work well with someone. And the relationship develops well, and you know that trust has been built. So my recommendation to many companies is sign a 1-year contract first. 2 months prior to the termination date, start the negotiations of renewal. Because generally, you're going to give an increase anyway after the 1st year. And then the 2nd contract round could be open-ended. And like this, you're not at a situation where you have to terminate, but you are, taking the risk in the 1st year, signing a fixed term contract, seeing how the relationship develops, and then, in the 2nd year, you can have an open-ended contract because you've developed that trust and relationship with the individual. Termination of employees. Now, this is a critical subject that people don't really think about before hiring. And I've just put here a cartoon which I think reflects anything around the world. Would you prefer a quick termination or a slow, painful phase out? This is really a key point in China. Terminations are not easy. You need proof and evidence as to why you are looking to terminate an individual. And the evidence cannot be circumstantial. You need concrete proof of reasons. Has the person done something wrong? Does it reflect in the employee handbook that it's really type A for termination? You need to have all of this outlined in your employee handbook so that you can refer back to it and also then know at what level of the termination you can, or at what type of termination you can make. So there are various terminations. You have not at will termination, you have termination grounds, reasons for terminating, you have special categories of protected employees which you need to be aware of. For example, if your employee is sick, has cancer, or if your employee is in midst of a maternity, you cannot fire them at that point. That would be wrongful termination, and they could take you into court. You need to be aware of all the statutory severance packages that have to then be paid out. A typical termination, you have proof the person has done something wrong, you want to terminate the relationship. The standard termination is you have 1 month's notice, or you have to provide 1 month's salary. In addition to that, you need to pay 1 month's salary for every year the individual has worked for you. Again, which is why I recommend, to be sure of this employee, have a fixed term contract in the first year so you don't incur any of this severance payment that needs to be made if you do want to terminate them in the first year. You have automatic endings of employment contracts, so if you do sign a fixed term contract, it's up to you to decide whether you renew or you don't renew. If the employee resigns, you also need to understand what are their leave aspects. Can they give 30 days notice, or can they give more? It's very often the case that for senior management staff, you may want to negotiate with them that the resignation period, if they do resign, they have to give more than 30 days notice, so maybe 60 days, maybe 90 days. And if there are employment disputes, what options are available to you? Can you go to mediation? Do you go straight to the labor arbitration? What options do you have available to you? Now, as many people and many companies and HR managers are not fully aware of the labor laws in China, what many of them do, and I'm saying this out loud because many are not aware that this service exists, is that there are law firms in China that do offer the service of terminating senior managers on your behalf. It's always good to have a representative of the company there, but the lawyer would actually sit down with the employee and finalize the termination. And they do this particularly in cases where the person has done something wrong, or there's evidence that the person has done something wrong, or there's circumstantial evidence, but you still want to fire the individual. And then they go through the termination clauses, and it's at that point then where you also then have your lawyer negotiating the compensations or severance package, which is a key component. So be aware that law firms do provide this service, and it can come in very handy, particularly when the employees are in senior management positions. The next is understanding the social insurance system. So the social insurance system is applicable to both foreigners and mainland Chinese. It's mandatory. This is all over China. However, having said all of that, there are certain cities in China that have not implemented the social insurance scheme for foreigners, Shanghai being one of them. Now, the mandatory social insurance scheme has 5 funds. One is old age pension, basic medical, occupational accident, unemployment, maternity, and housing fund. In the slide in front of you, you will see a picture of the social insurance card that every individual who subscribes to the funds will obtain. The key point here is, where can you go to a doctor? You have to go to an authorized Chinese hospital or Chinese medical clinic in order to be able to be reimbursed. So as a foreigner, if you are required to pay these social insurance funds, it's not always an advantage to you. And from my perspective, being a foreigner in China, from my perspective, the social insurance fund, if you are in a city that requires the foreigners to pay it, you actually need to consider it more as just a cost. And ultimately, for any foreigner, you still want to make sure that they have a private insurance available to them in order to be able to recover funds. Because most foreigners are not going to go to a Chinese hospital, nor are they going to go to a Chinese clinic if they cannot speak in their own language, or at a minimum in English, in order to explain what's wrong with them in terms of health issues. Why am I so fixated on social insurance, and why do I find it so important? If you are going the route of doing freelance agreements, or if you are going the route of utilizing a third party, for example, your supplier, to employ in theory, your employees, I've seen too many cases where the individual either, one, never declares his social insurance, which, okay, it's his fault and his problem, or number 2, the company that you have asked to employ your staff, either it's the supplier or whomever, pockets the funds that you're remitting and never pays the social insurance and never pays the taxes and only remits the net salary to these individuals. Now, there's a classic case study in this where a client visited the supplier and visited his team, actually, and saw that one of his team members had a broken leg, was walking around on crutches with an envelope asking for funds from his colleagues. When he asked what he was doing, the guy said, well, I don't have social insurance, and I need to pay my doctor's bills. And I'm asking my colleagues if they can loan me some money in order to be able to pay for it. It is just standard human nature. If in Europe you're employed by a European company, you will want to make sure that you get social insurance. In China, it's the same. Be fair to your staff. Make sure you're paying salaries at market value. Make sure you're paying the social insurance. Make sure their taxes are being paid as well. It's just a matter of, one, compliance and making sure you're doing the right thing, but two, it's also just being fair to your staff that they are getting what they deserve. Now, there are investigations that are now occurring in regards to social insurance payments for employees and making sure that the appropriate rates are being paid. Well, first, that social insurance is being paid, but then also looking that the appropriate rates are being paid to them. If you are found out to not be paying social insurance, in worst case scenarios, you will be fined. You will not have access to your bank accounts, and the Labor Bureau could gain access to your bank accounts to then withdraw the necessary funds to repay and pay back all social insurance that is owed to the individuals. So just make sure you're doing the social insurance aspects all in compliance. Now, in this presentation, I have not listed out the rates of the social insurances. Why? Because every single city, depending on the standard of living in that city, has different insurance rates. As a consequence, if you want specific details, please do let me know and I can provide you what those rates are for that specific city. Also, be aware that minimum salary levels are different in every single city in China, again, based on the standard of living. So you can imagine tier 1 cities in China will have the highest rate of standard of living, and as a consequence, social insurance is at its highest and minimum wage levels are at their highest. So be aware of these various points as well. The last point is coming into the individual income tax in China. And on this page, I'm highlighting, am I subject to pay Chinese tax? And this really comes down to individuals that are primarily on freelance agreements. So if you have a work permit and a residence visa, you are subject to pay Chinese tax. End of discussion. If, however, you are a businessman or you are just on a tourist or business visa, but you actually live in China, then you need to follow these 4 regulations. 1, if you're in China for less than 183 days in a calendar year, then you are not required to declare any type of income. If you are in China for more than 183 days, then you do need to declare income. And it is your responsibility as the individual, because there's no entity physically established in China, to make that declaration. Now, a lot of people then ask me, well, you know, when we started the project, we didn't know we were going to be there for more than 183 days. So at what point do I need to declare if I know I'm going to be there more than 183 days? Do I do it on the 183rd day? Do I do it before? In all fairness, if you know you're going to be in China for more than 183 days in a calendar year, you should be declaring taxes from day 1. You should be declaring those taxes in the district that you're residing in. So if your service apartment, hotel, or your physical apartment is located in a specific district, you need to go to that tax bureau and file your taxes. Now, you should also be aware that even though you're filing taxes in China, you just need to take the tax declaration form and provide that in your home jurisdiction to the tax bureaus, and in theory, it is deductible. But this is all part of your tax optimization planning. You need to know how to sort all of this out between the 2 jurisdictions. Now, if you're living in China between 1 and 5 years, I certainly hope you have a work permit and a residence visa, and in that case, then you will be paying taxes on your China-sourced income. If you're living in China for more than 5 years, and this is a critical point because we do see a lot of foreigners now staying in China, is that you are ultimately liable to pay personal income tax on your global income. So if you've been splitting your salaries between a China-sourced income and an overseas income, starting from your 6th year, you will be required to pay taxes in China on both sources. Now, the key point here is breaking your tax residency. It's a key component because you can break your tax residency in China. You can break your tax residency at any point within those 5 years, and then you start from scratch. If you don't do it within those 5 years, then in your 5th year, you would need to leave China for at least 30 straight days or a total of 90 days in the calendar year. Now, as I mentioned in my webinar related to accounting and tax system in China, what is the objective of the Tax Bureau? The objective of the Tax Bureau is to make sure they have the highest level of tax revenue. And I've seen too many cases now where tax officers will say, no, you did 30 days straight. No, you're wrong. You should have done the 90 days in total. Or they may say vice versa. You did 90 days in total, but you didn't do the 30 days straight. Sorry, you have to pay now on your full global income. So obviously, although it's not convenient, it's not efficient, for those individuals, I would recommend to do both, 30 straight days and 90 days in total in order to break the tax residency, just to be protected and know that you have no issues that are occurring with the tax officer. Now, any foreigner in China, as well as any mainland Chinese, can obtain allowances from the company. The key question I get asked is, how much out of a compensation package should be made up of allowances? Because obviously allowances can be tax deductible, and no individual wants to pay a lot of taxes. That's common sense. So my rule of thumb, because nothing is written black and white with the various laws and with the various offices of the government, my rule of thumb is not more than 30% of the total compensation should be made up of allowances. If you have a 50-50 split, it's too obvious what you're doing. So for me, a 30-70 split where 30% of your compensation package is allowances and 70% is salary, that's for me a much, or let me say, I've never had discussions on that breakdown. Anything above 30, they start questioning. And what you also need to be aware of is that the tax bureaus need to approve the allowances that are being offered to the individual. So it needs to be stated in the employment contract what allowances are being offered, and how much of the compensation package is going to be made up of allowances. In addition to all of that, it is the responsibility of the individual to make sure they collect all the fapiaos, the official receipts for those allowances. If they do not, if they go under that amount, then unfortunately those items will not be tax deductible, only up to the amount that the fapiaos, the receipts, have been provided. So it's important to know exactly how to compensate for everything, and can the individual actually obtain the necessary official receipts in order to be able to make the deductions. Then obviously the next question is, I know that I'm required to pay taxes. How do I pay taxes? So the important point here for foreigners, and I've put the calculation here for foreigners, and if you're interested for the calculation for the Chinese, I'll explain that as well. For the foreigners, you're looking at the monthly, you want to know what your monthly taxable income is. So you're looking at the monthly gross income. You're going to do an automatic deduction of 4,800 renminbi. It's automatic, it's fixed. That's a rule in China for every single foreigner. And you also can deduct an allowance, which is called and then you can also deduct your allowances. That's how you get to the monthly taxable income. At that point, you apply, you go to the table that's on the presentation that I've shown, you look at the appropriate category, you look at the tax rate, and you will then get a further quick calculation deduction that is provided. Now, compared to mainland Chinese, the only differences in the calculation is related to this 4,800, where for Chinese it's 3,500, and for foreigners it's 4,800. So that's basically the overview of what you need to know in terms of the issues related to foreigners in China, in terms of the legal aspects, contract aspects, social insurance, immigration, and tax. Barbara, maybe we can leave it to questions and answers now.
Okay, thank you so far, Christina. There are a series of questions that have come in from our attendees today. Let's start with the first one. What are your thoughts on freelance agreements in China? We are not prepared to establish an entity in China just yet. Can we employ a staff, foreigner or local, via a freelance agreement while he works in China? What legal consequences are there? What consequences are there for the foreigner, if foreigner or local, if any?
So I did touch on freelance agreements throughout my presentation, but maybe I should delve into it a little bit more. So as I mentioned, freelance agreements are really gray. There's no black and white regulation stating that freelance agreements are legal. What a lot of companies do is that they actually don't even write agreements. They verbalize the informal agreement via email or telephone conversations, and then they don't put it into any formal agreement, which is anyway not good for your headquarters if they're making the payments to the individual in China. So you do want to have some type of formal agreement that's filed then in the accounts of the headquarters so that they can verify the payments that are being made on a monthly basis. What you also need to be aware of is how that payment is going to be structured. So are you going to do a fixed salary every month, or are you going to do a base salary plus commission if the guy is actually a sales guy? Freelance agreements, from my perspective, I don't like them. My perspective is if you are hiring someone, that's already a level of commitment to the market, and my suggestion would be that you set up an entity, whether it's a representative office or a limited company. I've seen also a lot of people persuade the Chinese individual to set up his own domestically owned company and then invoice the company overseas, which for me is the best route to take if you're going to do any of this, is have this Chinese individual set up his own company, and from that company he invoices the headquarters for his services. And obviously then you will have a formal service agreement, you will have an invoice, and it's a formal structure from a corporate level to a corporate level and not from a corporate to an individual level. The question is, will this individual set up his own company? And I guess that's a negotiation point. But my point is, if he's anyway going to set up a company, then wouldn't you want to set up your own company anyway to then do the transactions that are occurring locally? So that's just food for thought. If you go the route of this corporate individual relationship, my only tip is have a formal agreement and make sure in that formal agreement you're specifying that he is responsible for declaring his portion of social insurance and he's responsible for declaring income tax on the income he's earning. And that you as an HQ, it's not a formal employment agreement, it's a freelance agreement. He's like a service agent or a trading agent, and what you're offering to him is commissions. In this freelance agreement, don't formalize it as an employment contract. That, again, might create problems in the future. So these are just a few tips in regards to going around all of that. My other suggestion is don't make that relationship so long-term. What I mean is do it for a year, see how it goes, and you really should decide after that year whether you want to set up a company or not, and then formally employ him. Don't become lazy, and then after 5 years, you know, he's had this informal type of arrangement and he has leverage over you. It gets into very tricky situations and very tricky negotiation points at a later stage.
All right, so here we have the second question. I have the business license for my company in China. Can I already start employing people? What are the procedures to do this?
Yes, so once you, if you are establishing your company in China, one of the first licenses you'll obtain is your business license. It still takes about 6 to 8 weeks to open bank accounts, which people don't really always realize. So once you get your business license, you can draw up and formulate contracts as you wish, whether it's with suppliers, customers, or even employees. So you can formulate the employment contract, you can create the employee handbook, you can start negotiating terms and conditions of the employment. But what you might have difficulties is, depending on how quickly you can do all that formulation, is the bank account, your corporate bank account. How are you going to pay the salary if the corporate bank account is not yet opened? So you're in this interim phase where you can do all of these documentations, but then you're in this phase also where you cannot pay salaries and you cannot pay social insurance and you cannot declare the taxes yet. So although you may have the business license, I would suggest waiting a certain period of time when it's clear in your mind when you can actually pay the salaries. And that's just a matter of understanding the timeline of the whole incorporation phase.
All right, another question was the following. You have been speaking on employment in China for market entry clients. We're looking to close down our operations due to the economic downturn. What do we need to consider to terminate agreements?
That's a very good question. So, and it's coming up more and more often. If you are downsizing, and if in your articles of association, one of the reasons for exiting the market is the fact that you're losing money, then obviously the first step is formulating a liquidation committee and knowing that you are going to close down the company. And one of the first steps is obviously dissolving all the contracts, selling all your assets, etc. And that's a very hard discussion to have with the employees. It's you have to go to all the employees and say to them, we are dissolving the company, we're liquidating the company, we now have to terminate all the agreements. Here you have to do an analysis. You need to review each person's employment contract. What are the terms and conditions of that employment contract? Hopefully in the termination clause, there's been a sentence put in stating that termination will also be granted if the company is dissolving. You then have to look at each individual status within the company. How long have they been with the company? What is their salary level? And you need to evaluate then the total years of service to the company and what is then the compensation owed to them. Generally, when you're dissolving the company, you will probably give 30 days notice versus 1 month's salary. So it will be a slow, painful termination, as I call it, versus a quick termination. And if all of that is true, if you are truly liquidating or if you are downsizing truly because the economy is going bad, then it's just a matter of a formal discussion with the employees and making sure you have the leverage, you know the status very clearly, and you know what the situation is of that individual. If there are special circumstances, so for example, you have an employee that's on maternity leave, or you have an employee that is sick, this is where you really need to understand the labor laws associated with that in terms of terminating. If you are just downsizing, most likely you wouldn't be able to terminate those individuals. If you are liquidating the company, then yes, you would be able to terminate.
Okay, there was another question on the termination of agreements. In general, how easy is it to terminate agreements with foreign or local employees? What happens if you want to terminate the working visa for a working visa of a foreigner?
So terminating employment contracts, I think, is not easy anywhere in the world. If you're sitting in China or you're sitting in Europe or you're sitting in the US, it's not an easy task to go to an employee and say you're terminated. I think in China, it's a relatively straightforward process, but I think people sometimes underestimate the cultural aspect. The Chinese do lose face. So the point here is, again, knowing the individual, knowing what is the status of that individual, formulating a severance package for that individual if you're terminating them. If you're terminating on grounds that they have done something wrong, then in that meeting, again, you need to have the leverage. You need to have the evidence that they've done something wrong, that they can't counter you in any shape or form, which again is why I do recommend to hire lawyers to assist if there are senior level management positions that need to be terminated, to have assistance in terms of that you have the leverage in the termination phase. Have terminations gone airy? Yes, they have, especially for clients that weren't aware of the labor laws or the labor regulations, and then they follow up after the termination as to what they should have really owed or should have really paid. Know in advance. That would be my main key point for you. Know in advance. Make sure you have the leverage when you're having these termination discussions. And I tell you this, whether it's a foreigner sitting in front of you or whether it's a local sitting in front of you.
All right, so here we got the last question for today's session. Could you provide a case study on poor HR planning? What are your recommendations for what not to do in China?
Poor HR planning would really be that you're hiring people without having any formal agreements in place. And like I said earlier, this does happen. Before you start hiring a single individual, make sure you have negotiated with them. Make sure that you have the employment contracts on hand. Make sure you have both parties signing these employment contracts. The key also for me is employee handbooks, that you can reference back to your employee handbook in case you do need to terminate anybody. And understand, what are just general labor practices. I always think information is power, and knowing certain labor practices is a key point. What are maternity regulations? If you're hiring a lot of females, that would be a critical point. Do men get maternity leave in China? That's also another critical point you need to be aware of. What happens if there's a death in the family? For specific public holidays, can you give extended leave or can't you give extended leave? What are the general terms in terms of holidays and annual leave? Everybody can create their own policies, but people should know first of all, what are the regulations in terms of all of that, if any, and what generally do foreign investors do with some of those regulations. So again, it's advisable to talk to an advisor about creating the appropriate employment contracts and creating the appropriate employee handbooks. I think it's also a matter of just generally creating the right compensation and being fair on it and knowing what market value is, and being up to date year on year how the rates change in terms of salary. I think that's also a critical component. In China, from my perspective, the mainland Chinese are they just want to know, they just want to have an increase consistently of their net salary in their pocket. So you need to know if they're asking you for something, is that market rate? Is that a fair value? If they've gone over the market rate, then you need to evaluate, is this person worth it or not? There's so much turnover in China, unfortunately, because people are so focused on keeping employees, and they just pay exorbitant amounts that are above market value, which makes it, one, difficult to find good people, good skilled people, and two, to retain them. So it's important to have an understanding of what's going on in the market in that regard. And obviously, in terms of foreigners, I think the key component is just making sure that he's safe in China, that he has his paperwork done, that his family has his paperwork done, and that everything is renewed on a timely basis. And I think those are really the key components.
All right, thanks a lot. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time to answer all of your questions. But in case you have further questions or want to talk about your individual cases, please contact Christina privately after the webinar. Here in this slide, you can see her contact details. You will be receiving a copy of this presentation together with Christina's contact information. We hope that you enjoyed this webinar session. We just want to remind you of all our upcoming webinars in this series. If you're interested, please register for the webinars on our website. The recording of this webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel and distributed on our social media sites such as LinkedIn, Xing, and Twitter. In addition, if you're interested in our weekly e-campaign highlighting all the latest resources we publish, do not hesitate to subscribe. It is free of charge and can be easily done on our homepage by inserting your email address into the section called ChinaInvest.biz. Thank you again, Christina, for presenting to all the attendees and registrants. Thank you also to all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a pleasant evening and goodbye.